Γεια σας. Ευχαριστούμε πολύ όλους που ήρθαν σήμερα το βράδυ. Θα μιλήσω αγγλικά για τη Flavia, που δεν μιλάει ελληνικά. So in English too. Hello everyone, thank you for coming, especially on such a football day. I see we have some men here, so I'm very impressed. My name is Gonu, and I am the Contemporary Program Advisor at the museum, in case someone doesn't know me. We are very excited to have Flavia Frigeri with us tonight. This is the first talk around our exhibition, Cindy Sherman at Cycladic, that you will see shortly. Early works, sorry, that you will see tonight. We plan to have many talks and parallel events, and this is our first one. I would like to thank, first of all, our Contemporary Support Committee for making all these events and the exhibition possible, and also Aegean Airlines for the support for these events and the exhibitions and everything throughout our program. Dr. Flavia Frigeri, we are so happy to have you here tonight. Flavia and I met many years ago when she was at the time curator at the Tate, and I collaborated with Jessica Morgan, another very good friend of the museum, who curated around that time another exhibition for us. I think you collaborated on The World Goes Pop. Since then, right now Flavia is the curator, I should say it properly. She's an art historian, lecturer, and the Chanel curator for the collection at the National Portrait Gallery in London, where she's leading a project set to redress the gender imbalance in the collection through acquisitions and site-specific commissions. So quite an activist position. She recently guest curated the group exhibition Beyond Form, Lines of Abstraction from 1950 to 1970 at the Turner Contemporary in Margate. She's now working on a retrospective of the avant-garde French-Portuguese artist Maria Helena Vieira da Silva for the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice. From 2016 to 2020, she was a teaching fellow in the History of Art department at UCL and a member of faculty at Sotheby's Institute London. As I mentioned before that, she was at Tate, where we met. And there she was also responsible for the Henri Matisse The Cutouts exhibition, Paul Klee Making Visible and Ruins in Reverse. She is the author of Pop Art and Women Artists, both in Thames and Hudson Art Essential series, and the co-editor of a volume of collected essays, New Histories of Art in the Global Post-War Era, Multiple Modernism, and also of the book Women Artists, that we are very happy to have at our shop, so you can find it there. And I should mention here that Flavia also wrote one of the texts for a catalog that will be published soon for the exhibition. Cindy Sherman, her work is open to many readings and many approaches. So tonight, Flavia will talk. It will be her response to our exhibition. Flavia, thank you very much. And I give the microphone to you. Thank you.
Thank you to the entire team here at the museum for having me, and thank you especially for Aphrodite for inviting me to speak about Cindy Sherman, an artist that I've long really been passionate about. So this felt like the perfect opportunity to write, but also think more about works that I feel many of us may have encountered before. Now, without any further ado, I'll launch straight in. And I'm starting from something very recent that you won't find in the exhibition. This is the only thing that you won't find in the exhibition. So for the Spring-Summer 2024 campaign, the fashion label, Marc Jacobs, roped in many of their long-term collaborators, and these included Dakota Fanning, F.K. Twigs, Lila Moss. But more to the point, Marc Jacobs invited Cindy Sherman to take part in the campaign. And you see here two of the shots. And what's interesting about them, now she's posing with, the Marc Jacobs bag, and, that's a promotional side of it. But what's interesting about it is she's taking on two distinct personas. So in one, she appears with, long hair, damp, curly wig, in a sort of like white cardigan, legs splayed open, quite a masculine pose. Whereas in the other one, she takes on a very different persona. She has a very neat wig, she's very poised, she's wearing high boots, very self-contained in many ways. And these are just two of the many personas that Cindy Sherman has taken on over her long career. Both of the images were shot in New York in front of the Marc Jacobs offices, and they very much speak in a way to the stereotypes of femininity, which is what much of her work is about, and especially the works that you'll see in the show in a few minutes, really. But now, moving from sort of her most recent appearance, I want to take you all the way back to her very first work. And this is a work, the one that I'm about to show you, it's a short 3-minute video that she made as a student. So she initially trained as a painter in Buffalo. That's where she studied. But during her training as a painter, she realized that that wasn't the medium she wanted to specialize in. She was fascinated by photography and really interested in film. And really, if you think about, those are the two pillars of her practice, film and photography. And initially, she was bringing together a hybrid of the two, and I'll elaborate on this in a second, once you've seen the film. Okay, there you go. Okay. Discussing, and while I speak, it's going to go in the background again, but discussing doll clothes in 2006, Cindy Sherman explained, "When I was a young teenager, I made little drawings of all my clothes, and each Sunday night, I would figure out my school outfits for the week. The human hands that appear in the film, the artist suggests, are like the parent telling the child that she is misbehaving and has to stay in the book." Now, in this case, the misbehaving child is a woman, and that's quite significant. And it's quite significant how the woman is being pigeonholed into a certain identity, in this case, into a plastic case. And as you could see, as the images were scrolling through, she was, there were different clothes appropriate for different settings, and all of this is part of the idea of a feminine construction. And much of Cindy Sherman's work is about constructions of femininity, and especially at the hands of society. At the same time, and I don't know if she would necessarily agree with me saying this, but I'm going to say it, I think a lot of that film is also about the idea of freedom and how much freedom women have in defining their own identity and their own frameworks. But also it's telling in terms of something else, which is Sherman is removing herself as a subject. And this you'll see what I mean as we go through other examples. It's her body, she is the paper doll, but that work is not about Cindy Sherman, it's about a woman, a paper doll. And she uses her body throughout her work as really a stand-in for types and stereotypes. And then finally, it's one of the first works where she uses photography. In this case, she's still combining photography with film. And very early on, she was creating these storyboards or short films where she would bring together different photographs she would make, and then she would assemble them into a film, as in this case, or in a storyboard. And for her, photography is very much what for a painter, paint and brushes are. It's a medium. Her work is not so much about the photographic medium, but it's using photography in a way with a narrative purpose. Now, interestingly, she chose not to show this film for over 29 years. It was only in 2004 when she had an exhibition in New Jersey that she decided to show it. But this, for me, is a great prelude in terms of all these aspects of her work that I just described that very much inform what perhaps is her better-known series of works, which are the Untitled Film Stills, which you're going to see the complete series in the exhibition. And from this point onwards, I'm really going to focus on the works that you're going to see in the show in a few minutes. Now, the Untitled Film Stills, and I'm sure many of you have encountered them before. They're a series of black and white photographs that she made when she moved in 1977 to New York. She had completed her studies in Buffalo at that point, and she's moving to New York as a young artist. She's also working in a sort of independent project space called Artist Space. And she's starting to really find her, let's say, find her language, but also find the subject of her work. And these works came to being very much as explorations of the ideas she had already tested before, but also of a desire to draw onto her filmic culture. So the inspiration for the series is mostly 1940s and 1950s cinema, and particularly that of Hollywood directors like Alfred Hitchcock, which she had, as a child, she had been very passionate about film. She recalls that she would watch the same movie up to 10 times to really absorb it. And in the case of Rear Window, which is what you're seeing on screen here, she said once, recalling the sort of genesis of the works, she said, "I had to go with my parents to a dinner party and wound up watching TV in the basement, eating my little dinner alone, watching Hitchcock's Rear Window, while the adults partied upstairs. I loved all of those vignettes Jimmy Stewart watches in the windows around him. You don't know much about any of those characters, so you try to fill in the pieces of their lives." And this particular last sentence is very important, filling in the pieces. I'm assuming most people here have watched Rear Window. It's a 1954 film by Hitchcock in which the main character, the news photographer Jeffries, is confined to a wheelchair after an accident. So pretty much he entertains himself by observing the life around him through his camera and trying to imagine what's happening. And his girlfriend, who is Grace Kelly, comes to him and says, "Tell me," there's a scene where she says, "Tell me everything you saw and what you think it means." And again, what do you think it means? It's this idea of interpreting a life through an image, still. And this is what Cindy Sherman is taking away from this movie when she starts thinking about her film stills. Now, initially, her idea was to do a whole series of works focusing just on one actress, a blonde, wigged actress, and she was going to try and perform different stages and different possible movies of this actress's life. But very quickly, she realized that that wasn't interesting. She wanted to create precisely what was happening in Rear Window, moments, stills from different lives. So you see here two very good examples where we're encountering two figures, and immediately we wonder what's going on. The woman who's surrounded by the skyscrapers, we imagine she is a young working girl, she's in New York, but there's something that's capturing her attention. She's looking elsewhere. Who is she looking at? What is she doing? Where is she going? And similarly, the woman who's instead, lying on the bed, we're wondering what has happened to her. Why is she there? What is her experience? And these are the kinds of questions that come up again and again in all of her film stills. And she wants you to fill the blanks with your imagination, because there's no narrative really. Now, when she was thinking about the blonde actresses at the beginning, the ones she had in mind were these kinds of film stars of her day. People like Grace Kelly, Monica Vitti, but also, she had in mind Jean Moreau. She was thinking about the stereotype of the actor. And she was also looking at all sorts of movies. It wasn't just Hitchcock. She was looking also at very sort of cheap and bad B movies with terrible acting. And she had friends who worked at Barnes & Noble's, the bookshop in New York, and they would bring her back these movie magazines, these books, and she would copy and sort of absorb the kind of images and stills that she would find in them. And so once she moved away from the idea of just having one character, she really went, I guess, full in and started imagining all sorts of characters, wearing all types of outfits, all types of wigs. From very early on, she was someone who very much liked dressing up. She remembered how she was given access to her grandmother's trunk of clothes and loved trying on dresses and outfits. And even when she was a student, she said, basically she couldn't afford to buy new clothes, so she would go to thrift shops and really enjoy mixing and matching and imagining characters of other eras, really. So when she started really investing in the film stills as these moments, she started buying all sorts of wigs. As you can see, in one she's wearing this dark wig and she has this very heavy makeup. And it's this very sort of distressing scene of, someone who's experiencing something quite tragic in their life. And then, similarly in the outdoor shot that's also on this slide, she's again wearing a black wig, but in this case we see someone, from a distance. We're really peeking in as a voyeur in the same way that the photographer of Rear Window is a voyeur. And she puts us in this position, and you'll find yourselves in this position when you see the works later. You are forced into it. And that is part of the work. The work is not just her performing it, it's you performing along with her in the act of viewing. And she's, this woman who's outdoors, she's escaping, she's going somewhere, but we don't know exactly where. One thing she was very adamant in creating all of this range of characters was that she didn't want you to have a sense that there was a continuum between these images. Each is its own story. So I think for a long time she was also quite strict about how they were displayed, and she wanted them to be displayed in many different ways, so that every time you had the perception that it was a different range of stories that she was presenting. But also it's quite interesting to comment on the film still, which gives the title to these works. And because it's quite important to her structure. So all 70 of Sherman's film stills follow the exact same format. They're 8 by 10-inch replicas of the film stills that were originally envisaged by the film industry to promote the arrival of new films. So it was essentially a marketing tool. They were made for marketing purposes, and they were not frozen images taken from the actual movie. They were created specifically for marketing. So they had a very specific sort of structure to them. They had to be the kind of images that caught your attention, that were very sage and sometimes had very bad acting, over-the-top acting, because they were meant to lure you into watching a movie, into wanting to go and buy a ticket and watch the movie. And so she took this format and wanted to create her own sort of luring experience of these narratives. And so she sort of played with the grotesque side of this marketing exercise. And each of the 70 women, and you can spend hours looking at them and sort of picturing what their story is, you have a sense that there's a plot twist somewhere there. You just don't know what that is. And I'll just show you a few more. I'm not going to show you all 70 because, you know, you're going to very much experience those in the exhibition shortly. But here you see other 2 examples. So one, very often she uses this device where she has letters, she has phones, she has props that suggest there's some sort of communication, but also a failed element of communication there. Is this a letter from a lover? Is this a letter from a long-lost person? Again, we can project all sorts of readings on it. And then at the same time, you have ones where, for instance, the one where she's wearing this towel, where she's performing images of femininity and beautification. And I'll come back to this in a second, the sort of meaning, the wider meaning behind these works. But she's very much playing along these ideas of types of women. And the type of women that is a pretty woman is one that she's very much challenging in all of these images, really. And sort of now I'm going to quote her, because as much as it's my interpretation, it's also really very much her work that deserves to be explained. And she explains, these women are on their way to wherever the action is, or to their doom. And doom is an interesting word here, because it's quite a dramatic word. Or have come back from a confrontation. So they're experiencing some sort of extenuating circumstance. They're frozen in this mid-action, and you are caught in the in-betweenness. But mainly they are types. There's a city girl, there's a girl who's roaming the city at night alone, there's the crying girl, there's the anxious girl, there's the anxious letter reader, there's the battered woman, there's a woman staring into a mirror, there's a housewife, there's a femme fatale, there's a career girl, there's a tourist, there's a domestic. These were the kind of roles in which women were cast in those movies at the time. So she's reperforming them all, but always with a very sort of ambiguous underpinning to them. And here are 2 more examples. And I'll say something about how she made the images, because that's also quite interesting, I find. Now, she's always been an artist who has liked to work alone, insofar that she likes to use her own body as an instrument, because, you know, using her own body means she can control and push herself to a limit that would be impossible if she was working with a model. And she spoke about this. So she's the subject, she's the object, and she's the maker all at once. She's in charge of the photography. And when she's doing interior images, which, as far as I understand, were her preferred medium, she started by working in her own small loft where she was living in New York. And what she would do is she would rearrange different parts of her loft, move furniture around, change the poses, use the doorway, use the lobby, use props to give the sense that she was creating lots of different environments. But at some point, as much as you can be creative, you exhaust your environments. And that's why she started taking her images out. And she started using outdoor spaces. And outdoor spaces were more challenging because outdoor spaces are being lived by other people. So this is a time when, you know, downtown Manhattan maybe wasn't quite as popular as it is today. So she would find after hours, after 6 p.m., when people had gone home, she would find it quite deserted. And so she would move around with her tripod. And she would often have the help of partners, friends, whoever it was on hand, who would literally, she would set up the tripod and they would take the picture. But she would have to change, put on the makeup, the wig, wherever she could. And she later on remembered how at the time it felt so casual and easy. You could just get changed and naked on the street and no one would really bother. But if you did that today, people would be shocked and probably report you to the police, which I think is a very true statement. And wherever she went, she would do the same exercise. So she was traveling at some point with her family and she asked her father to take the pictures. She used a swimming pool where her nieces were swimming. She would use every opportunity. And I'm saying this here because the image that you see there, that interior, it's the home of a collector living in Los Angeles. And a friend of hers called Nancy Dwyer was house-sitting this house, and Cindy Sherman rocked up and essentially used that as a backdrop to one of her images. So wherever she was, she kind of used these opportunities. And as a rule, and I'm going to quote her here, she would take only a finite amount of images of each character. She said, generally, I didn't take more than 6 shots of any one character or scene. I was also being thrifty with film. I didn't want to waste a whole roll on just one character. She was very sort of controlled. The other thing that she did in parallel with this, as I told you before, she was working at this. You know, she hadn't established herself as an artist, so she had to earn a living working. And she was working at Artist Space, and sometimes she would go to work in character. So once she went dressed as a nurse. Another time she went dressed as some other character that I can't remember. And she would try and sort of live the life of that character in her own life. So this sort of doubling up. But then at some point she stopped, and I'm going to quote her because it's quite funny. She said, "If I look weird, I'll attract weirdos." So she decided it was best not to dress up in her real life and kept it just to the photography. And as the series progressed, and I think this is a question that surely, you know, artists who work in series ask themselves all the time, where do you begin, you know, but where do you end? And she said, as the series progressed, I would make lists of things I thought were missing to round out the group. This included types of shots and locations, notes of suitable places. Wherever she was traveling, and I told you before, she would buy wigs, costumes, start dressing up and inventing. But then there was a point when, in a way, she felt the characters she wanted to do had exhausted themselves. She had done them. Now, I've really very much now focused on sort of the aspects, one could call them the formal aspects of these works, but there's a whole layer to them, which is a layer of meaning. What is she trying to get us to think about? Now, first of all, I'm going to say something very obvious, but she intentionally called these untitled because she didn't want to give you any narrative information. And that, again, is because you are completing the image with your act of viewing. Now then, there's a whole layer to this that brings us back to that early video that I showed you, which is very much about identity. Now, some commentators and theorists who have worked on these images have said that they are perhaps addressing issues of identity and the complex relationship that an artist has with its own self-portraiture. Now, I kind of disagree with this because I think the way she uses self-portraiture is a very specific way. She's a stand-in for a character. In fact, she's someone who was very adamant always to say, these are not about me. And she said, it's not that I'm experiencing anything tragic in my life. These women are not embodying my feelings. They are others. They're characters. So I think there's more about a fascination with the idea of transforming herself, which brings us back to the experience as a child of dressing up with her grandmother's clothes that made her so adamant to go and collect things from thrift stores, wear wigs. It's this idea of transformation. And this idea of like exploration within transformations. But also, I think there's, and here perhaps all the work I've done on gender makes me see these works also in terms of gender and thinking about the stereotypes that they're trying to explode. Now, many have asked Cindy Sherman over the years, they have said to her, are these works feminist works? And can we read them as feminist works? And she has repeatedly rejected that idea. I mean, artists love also generally rejecting ideas and categories. So everything needs to be taken with a pinch of salt. But she has said, the mimicry of the style of black and white, grade Z motion pictures that produced the self-consciousness of these characters were what she was interested in, not her knowledge of feminist theory. So it was really the characters and, in a way, the cinematic culture of those characters. Now, maybe she wasn't looking for something explicitly feminist, but by presenting us with a whole lexicon of female identities from the dumb blonde, the helpless young girl, the hysteric woman, the femme fatale, she's exposing and challenging the nature of these stereotypes. And these stereotypes very much are associated with women and constructed by society. So it is a fiction of a fiction that she's after. And her characters are very much the offspring of a very sort of male-dominated society, and especially those movies at that time. And as the cultural theorist Judith Williamson explained, she said, what Sherman does is to make you see types of women of femininity as inseparable from the literal presentation of the image. So it's like this idea, it's like the doll. Women being these very flat figures that can only have one stereotypical identity, and that's it. You dress them for the office, you dress them for, the party. They're these one-dimensional personalities. And in sort of showing us these one-dimensional personalities, she's making us think about it and challenging them. So it's very much about the artificial nature of construction and representation that the work is about. And then, sort of, as you can imagine, she's been interrogated about this for a very long time. But she also admitted something that I also find very interesting. She said, I'm not sure if I was yet aware of the fact that in most early films, women who don't follow the accepted order of marriage and family, who are strong and rebellious characters, are either killed off in the script or see the light and become tamed and join a nunnery or something like that. So either they become nuns or they get killed off. But then she concludes that usually they die that's kind of, that's the thing that happens to women who don't follow the right path. And then she admits unconsciously in creating these women, like, this one outside of the door who's leaning on the door, and you, again, have a sense that something has gone terribly wrong there. It's quite ominous. She's giving visibility to these characters that have strayed away. They're both stereotypes, but they've also strayed away from the conventions of what women should do. Now, like all good things, also the Untitled Film Stills came to an end, and she admitted, "I thought I could go on indefinitely with these characters, but by 1980, fashion styles had begun to absorb a lot of the clothes I was using. Nostalgia was in, so I started to think the work was looking a little too fashionable. I didn't think about what I was leaving behind. For the most part, I really had no clue what other people would come to think of this work." And this is a moment where she bids goodbye, again, as you'll see in the show, to black and white photography and turns to color images. And she starts experimenting with color because she thinks that the problem with black and white photography, it has that sense of nostalgia. We associate it to early 20th century photography, 19th century photography. Whereas color is of the moment, is of the now. And yet she's still sort of like wrestling with the idea of the cinematic culture from which her early works stem from. And she goes on to create this body of work called rear screen projections. And again, this is a cinematic technique, which essentially means that it's a back projection, and it's quite an old-fashioned technique in which actors are filmed in front of a projection. So there's a sort of discrepancy between the projection and the actor. And it's kind of a way of creating an illusion. And the word illusion is quite important here. And just to say, this is a technique that also Hitchcock used, so she's coming back to that sort of cinematic culture. Now, what these works are about is, again, they present us with a range of characters. Now, you have here a woman in front of a highway, and here you have two other examples. One of this woman drinking, one of, again, a woman looking with a sort of element of fear in her eyes. Now, what changes here is the images are much more about close-ups. They bring the figure right in front of your face. You'll see the scale of them grows in comparison to the film stills. But also there's quite a contrast between background and foreground. You can see the background is very soft because it's the effect of that rear projection, whereas the images of the figures up front are quite sharp. And what she likes this effect, because for her this effect speaks to the idea of illusion and fiction. And this is, something she was already looking at with the film stills, but also it becomes something that she starts really thinking about, the illusion of images. Now, I think this has since grown exponentially. We all live in an image-saturated world. I think on average, each of us experiences at least 1,000 images per day, which is a huge amount to take in. Now, the problem with images is images lie very often. They're fictions, they're not real. You think what you see is real, but not necessarily. It's very often a construction. And so what she starts doing with these works is really thinking about constructions and constructions of fictions. So there's less that sort of narrative element. This is more straight-on fiction imagination. And what also changes radically from the previous series is she starts working in her studio. And this is because, A, she was tired of getting changed, apparently, on the streets. She can control the light, she can control the setting, she's working alone, she uses everything is much more controlled, and this for her is almost kind of paramount at this point, is to be able to manipulate the image the way she has it in mind. and be less reliant on sort of case-to-case scenarios. And what these images also introduce is, in terms of like the mood they're really set in, is they're at once celebratory, but they're also very scornful. They're pleasing, and they're also sort of a bit worrying. Again, you have this sense that these women are clouded in some sort of traumatic experience. And this is something she carries forward in her next series of works, which are called centerfolds. And these, again, you're going to experience in the show when you visit it in a moment. And this is a body of work that came into being as a commission first. And at this point, she's gaining recognition. And she was commissioned by Art Forum, the art magazine, to make a series of centerfolds. And centerfolds are those images that unfold across a spread. And in taking on this brief that then eventually never materialized, she really started thinking about the tradition of the centerfold. What is that? What does that remind one? And she was thinking specifically of the kinds of, on the one hand, the girly magazines that will have at the center images of pop stars, that kind of sort of pop culture, but also she was thinking about, and perhaps even more importantly, about the sort of soft porn magazines aimed at men, which had women displayed naked at the center, occupying the centerfold. Now, what she does is, again, using her own body and her own self, she challenges the idea of the feminine beauty that graces the soft porn magazine and takes on these characters. I think you can see it already from this image of a girl that is very vulnerable. She's fearful. She's distressed. She's experiencing, again, something quite dramatic. The focus is very on the detail. There are no more props, have completely disappeared. And the perspective throws us into, again, this idea of we're like a voyeuristic experience we're having here. And as she explained, the whole intention of these works was to subvert the viewer's expectation, so that instead of finding a titillating image, they might be intruding on someone's private pain. And as you can see, they're very ridden with pain and anxiety. They're mostly young women. So at this point, she's also taking on sort of, rather than interpreting characters from different moments, she's interpreting all very young characters. And some are sort of not quite ridden with that same sort of mood of drama. This one is more like a young girl who possibly has received a love letter and she's trying to understand how to act or react. But what's interesting here is this reversal of the presentation of women in society again. Usually women are presented and packaged as these perfect beings, whereas here they're presented and packaged as very vulnerable beings. Now, her work, which very much always operates in series and evolves over time, kind of moves from one body of work to the next. And the year after the centerfolds, she moved on to something yet different from what I just showed you, which are the color studies. And this is very much the last group of works that you're going to see in the exhibition. And these color studies are, to me, maybe the most perplexing, are the ones that I still don't quite, if I have to be honest, I still don't quite know what to make of them. Because on the one hand, and one of the reasons why I decided to include the image on the left is almost she's challenging the idea of gender altogether. She performs a very androgynous figure. On the other hand, here it's a very feminine figure instead. But what these works and the way they're usually framed and discussed and thought about is they're works where she's really thinking about composition and color. So going back almost, one would think, to her pictorial training and trying to sort of dissect the things that make a painting or an image or a composition what it is. The structure, the color, the form. And so you have all of these figures who are like cast in these weird sort of blue lights, yellowish lights, that are once very alienating and sort of take them out of a clear setting. And increasingly, she seems to be moving away from those clear settings, only to come back to them later in her career with other works where she'll, portray women from high society to art historical pictures. So she's constantly, and still today very much, evolving this idea of the personas. But before I sort of wrap this up, I want to leave you with something. I want to come back to the film stills with, a quote, something that she admitted many years later that I find very beautiful. She said, when she was interviewed, and this was for a book that MoMA did on the film stills, I think in 2006, and she said, "Truthfully, I'm a little sick of these pictures. It's hard for me to get excited about them anymore. It's funny to see some of them now. Throughout my life, I've tried to keep looking different, so my hair has been all different colors, all lengths and styles. As a result, a lot of these characters look like me in the periods of my life since I shot the film stills. Perhaps, unconsciously, I've been following them, or at least their hairstyles. Occasionally, I felt that as I've gotten older, I've come to look more like them. It's kind of scary. I was always trying to look like older women." And I think this sums up very beautifully the sort of process, and perhaps the unconscious process, of what it means to take on so many different personas, all the way up to the Marc Jacobs commercial that I showed you at the very beginning. And now maybe you understand why I started with that one. Those are just two in the latest string of personas. And the woman with the wig and the sort of very neat dress, she looks very much like the girl in the film stills, just with a few decades later. So I think, what's really interesting about seeing this group of works that you're going to see in the show is really seeing this idea of how you can, with one person, create so many fictions, and how with so many fictions you really unpack the idea of what image making is, which, as I said, is something we all very much experience in our own lives. Thank you for listening.